I want to get into this issue of human dignity. And is it in our founding documents? And the dignity of youth. We talked about death with dignity. What about being a young person with dignity? None of my three kids, my kids are in their 30s. By the time I was in my 30s, Louise and I probably had bought our third house. And that's not like saying, hey, we were rich. Because the first house we bought was literally the downstairs was the living room and the bathroom, and the upstairs was the bedroom and the kitchen. And we had a waterbed upstairs, and it leaked, and it was a mess. And it was this little teeny tiny thing, but it was like the first house we bought. And we bought it for like, I don't even remember now. I mean, this was in the late 70s, early 80s, like $15,000 or something. I mean, it was, if that. And we didn't, and I put down a couple of months worth of paychecks on it, and we made payments on it. And then, we moved from that house to another bigger house, and that house to a bigger house, and we ended up buying the house that we made the most, I guess, on was the housing boom was going on. We bought a house when we moved to Vermont back in the mid-'90s, and we sold that house ultimately for more than twice what we paid for it. And I, looking back, I kind of feel guilty about that because, I was just selling it at the market, but it was just before the market collapsed. But the fact of the matter is that most of the retirement money that Louise and I have is either tied up in or is the result of our having been able to buy a house when we were 25 years old. And we've got a whole and one of my kids right now is in the process of buying a house. The first one for any one of these three, and this is I don't want to identify which kid and all that kind of thing, but this is somebody in their 30s who is not going to have the kind of equity that I had in my 50s until this child is in his or her 60s or 70s. And that's assuming that there's no more housing crash, and that's assuming that's assuming a lot of things. And I find this whole thing, we talked about death with dignity. What about life with dignity? What about young people being able to start their lives in America without being in debt? Now, I know Ronald Reagan, when he was governor of California, was agreeing aggressively with Russell Kirk and the other conservatives who were saying, these young people should not get free college. They should be indebted. They should have to pay for their education so they value it. And by the way, they're hassling poor old Ronnie, for, as Reagan he famously called them brats and said, why should I pay for the tuition of these brats who are just protesting my policies? I get all that. But human dignity. Shane did a really neat job of pulling together some of this stuff. The Pope touched on this theme. He said, a society that cannot offer a person the possibility of work is a society that has stripped this person of dignity. And by work, the Pope is pretty clear that he's talking about work the way Teddy Roosevelt talked about work. We played that clip on the air yesterday. A living wage, enough to live decently, enough to provide for old age, enough to care for your children, enough to pay for your health care, enough to take a vacation. That was Teddy, not Franklin, Teddy Roosevelt's definition of a living wage. The Pope said, power, money, culture do not give us dignity. Work, honest work, gives us dignity. Today, many social, political, and economic systems have chosen to exploit the human person by not paying a just wage, by not offering work. by focusing solely on the balance sheets, on the company's balance sheets, only looking at how much I can profit. This goes against God. End of quote from Pope Francis, excuse me. This goes against God. Does it go against the Constitution? Well, here's where it gets interesting. The Supreme Court arguably has said yes, human dignity is something that's in our Constitution. It's in the Eighth Amendment to begin with. The Eighth Amendment says that you cannot impose cruel and unusual punishment on people. The court has, in Fourth Amendment cases, characterized police behavior as offensive to human dignity. In Lawrence v. Texas, for example, Lawrence v. Texas was the Supreme Court ruling that struck down the anti-sodomy laws in Texas, that struck down the laws that made it a crime to be gay in Texas. And they set, in this majority opinion, they said the accused statute infringed upon a liberty interest that involved the most intimate and personal choices a person may make in a lifetime, choices central to personal dignity. Justice Stevens wrote, part of the constitutional liberty to choose is the equal dignity to which each of us is entitled. How is this not all tied together? And yet we're saying to this lost generation, we've got a lost generation, kids in their 20s and 30s, young people in their 20s and 30s, and a losing generation, those in their 40s, 50s, and 60s, who are discovering that, they've got basically two choices: either work for what somebody fresh out of college is willing to work for, which is damn near nothing, or be a greeter at Walmart. I mean, or just never get a job because, oh, hey, you're in your 50s, you're overqualified, or you're too old, or whatever. The health insurance is going to cost too much. I mean, we need to go back to the concept in this country. Twin concepts of a free college education, which we functionally had. I mean, Thomas Jefferson and Abe Lincoln, you've heard my rants on this, were big advocates of this and actually created free colleges. And college used to be, just right up until the Reagan presidency, was inexpensive enough. When Reagan came into office, 80% of the cost of tuition was paid for by state, federal, and local governments and the schools themselves. Now it's reversed. Now that 80% is paid for by the individual student. Only 20% is paid for by the state. And people say, oh, you've got inflation in tuition, and it's because the government is giving out Pell Grants and things. This is what conservatives say. That's nonsense. That's a lie. It's been an actual change in policy that is at the core of Reaganomics. So number one, we need to declare a jubilee on the trillions of dollars in student debt and simply say, that student debt never should have happened. That's our intellectual infrastructure. We should have paid for that collectively. We're going to take that $1 trillion and wipe it off the books. If George Bush can run up $1 trillion debt with one war in 1 year, and nobody says boo about it, then we can certainly wipe $1 trillion off the books for all that student debt. And yeah, some of those students might be from wealthy families. I don't care. So number one. And number two, we need to go back to the idea that Franklin Roosevelt laid out, that the best welfare program is a job. The government needs to become the employer of last resort.